going to St. Matthew, the 22nd chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him out into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Pretty good laugh this week as I read the Gospel lesson, which meant I immediately sent my fiance a text message that said, "This is how it went. This is me. You know what parable of Jesus I have to preach on this week?" His response was, "No, ... And I'm pretty sure he was thinking, "How am I supposed to know this? Isn't this your job, not mine?" And so then I text back to him, a parable about a king that sends out wedding invitations. To which he responds, "LOL, really?" And I text back, "Really?" And he said that was too funny. But it really was too funny because we are getting married in 2 months. Actually, 55 days, but except me, I've got that little wedding countdown app on my phone. But anyway, I sent out wedding invitations this week, the very same week that the king sent his out. The king hypothetically sent his out 2,000 years ago, but the comedic irony of God this week was so not lost on me. Anyway, I feel like I could probably give the king a few pointers on planning and inviting and hosting a wedding. And I think I could teach him a few things because he has obviously not been on Pinterest at all, or at least not very much, because he's made some huge, giant mistakes. He's gone about this thing the whole wrong way because something huge is amiss. Because those that are invited, they murder the postman when he shows up with the invitation, and then he sends out an army. The king sends out an army to kill all those people that killed his postman, right? And I'm sort of thinking as I'm reading this, the party can't possibly be that bad that you're going to kill one another over the party. And so through my sort of ironic lens this week, I thought, note to self, no sharp knives at the wedding. But anyway, in this parable, there's this horrible precedent set. Things are not going well at all. And then we learn, if we're paying attention, we learn that the strangeness and the weirdness doesn't even end with the murdering of one another. Despite all this mayhem, the dinner and the dancing is still going to go on. And so we're like, okay, sure. But there is no amount of money, and believe me, I put down money on deposits and caterers and stuff. There is no amount of money that would convince me that going through with this party that the king is planning at this point is a good idea. My advice to the king is have your son elope, save a little money, and save a lot of face at this point. But the king didn't ask me. As a matter of fact, he doesn't seem to care what anyone or anything thinks. And there's those jokes about brides becoming bridezillas, and I sort of thought that this guy, he's like Kingzilla. And this Kingzilla, this is the guy that we often liken to God. And this tradition has been perpetuated historically because the word king is often used as a stand-in for the word God in the Bible. And also because throughout tradition, God has used the metaphor of wedding to symbolize his relationship between himself and Israel. So because of these facts, it seems to make logical sense to apply those rules to this parable. Except for the fact that it's hard for me to fathom that Jesus, the one who goes to the poor, goes to the helpless, goes to the needy, goes to the broken himself, uses such a crass and domineering figure for himself. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I think that we can all recognize that this parable Jesus tells is different from the ways that God has spoken of himself in the past and of his relationship with Israel. It doesn't mesh up. We see and we hear how tortured this plot is. We hear the twists and the absurdities, and they sort of make our heads spin. But instead of asking, why is Jesus making our head hurt so much, we assume we apply those rules that we've always applied. So we assume that the parable is saying, well, God extends the invitation to come to the party, but there's standards once you come. Once you're in, you better meet those standards. And we also, if we apply those rules, it would say that if you aren't chosen, if you don't accept the invitation to the party, which seems more like a nightmare than anything else, but if you don't accept this invitation, then God has made this special place for you for torture. This doesn't sound particularly like the God I know. So I wonder, what if God isn't the king in this parable? So if you go with me for just a little bit, I know that what we always say is that God extends the invitation to us to be in relationship with him. All we have to do is respond. And I wholeheartedly believe in that. It is the basis for grace and for mercy. And so if you hear nothing else that I say today, that's actually the most important thing. That God is all about grace and mercy. Which, as an aside, is also one of the reasons I don't think that the invitation being extended in this parable is from God. It doesn't have a whole lot of grace or a whole lot of mercy in it. Plus, since I sent out a bunch of wedding invitations this week, I was reminded that we do also extend invitations. So what if we're the king? Now, typically, when we talk about inviting in church, it usually morphs into a bring a friend to church Sunday sermon, and I am not knocking that. But if this parable is about us being the king, Jesus' point certainly couldn't have been directed at getting people to invite others to church. That just wasn't his gig then. The overarching reason we extend an invitation is because we have an agenda. I mean, this is just the way humans are, right? I mean, like, I am having a wedding, so I'm going to have this big celebration. I'm getting married, and I want everybody to come. But at the end of the day, it's our party. I get to set all the standards. On my response cards, the guy couldn't help but laugh, because it talks about this wedding robe and the clothes are so important in this parable. So on my response card, I ask people to check if they're coming wearing dancing shoes, if they're coming wearing flip-flops, or if they're staying home in their slippers. I may give them choice, but I set the standards. And according to me, apparently, barefoot isn't even an option. Shoes are required. I mean, I consider myself a reasonable person, but you gotta at least wear shoes to my party. And by party, figuratively speaking, I mean all the things that we control. All the things that we get to do the inviting to. All the things that we say by virtue of dress or action about who is in and who is out. Which brings me to the point in the story with the guy that didn't dress the part. It's this chance of a lifetime, and he doesn't even get dressed up. Now, maybe he didn't have enough money to get the proper robe. Maybe he didn't know the dress code. I think the response card wasn't that clear. Except that the wedding robe we hear about today would have been provided when the guest arrived. All the guy had to do was put it on when it was handed to him at the front door. All he had to do was conform to the party standards. All he had to do was celebrate the king's good fortune. All he had to do was party like the other guests. And that's all he had to do. And he wouldn't. He wouldn't do and be and act the way the king wanted him to. He wouldn't be and do and act the way we want him to. Doesn't want to party like the rest of us. We may not like it, but I believe that we just may be the king in this parable. And so by now you know, right? The man is dressed so poorly. That's Jesus, isn't it? The man who chooses nonconformity, the guy not wearing the properness of society, the man who gets thrown out with all those dying outside the walls, with those who didn't hear about the party, with those who are weeping and gnashing their teeth. I mean, is there anybody else that would allow themselves to be thrown out into that type of hell? How did the king and the guests continue with the party? I mean, have they become so accustomed to the grinding of teeth and the wailing cries and the wringing of hands, they don't even hear the fight going on outside the walls? You know, it's curious because at the beginning it seems like the people knew. They knew that the king was missing the point, that the king was unfair, that the king was making a living at the expense of others. I mean, it says that they went to their jobs. It doesn't say that they threw their own party. But at some point, they became intoxicated by the lure of wealth and privilege, of drink and merriment. And they wanted to ensure that they were one of the chosen few. They wanted their security in place in this world, that their life was ensured somehow. Because that's the way the world works that we live in. We walk the walk, and we talk the talk, and we dress to impress. It is so apropos that we have a couple baptisms this week. We had one last night, and then we have one today. And in baptism, we put this gorgeous white garment on the child, symbolizing that he's clothed in the forgiveness of Christ, and reminding the parents of what a beautiful gift they have in their child. And it also reminds us that in Jesus, all of our failings and shortcomings are covered. And I get why we use a white garment. But there is very little that's clean and frilly and appropriately attired about Jesus. The clothes that Jesus chooses do not make the man, and they do not make the king, and they most especially do not make the Savior. Jesus dons a crown of thorns and a blood-stained robe, clothing himself in the pain and rejection and brokenness of all people. Jesus chooses the clothes of a servant, not those of a party-goer and not those of a king. And we try and kill him for it. We try to throw him out of our party. But it's funny, because the walk he walks is straight out of the party before we even get a chance sometimes. Because no matter how much noise rages on inside the party, it's not enough to drown out the wailings outside. Jesus still hears them. In some ways, I envision Jesus looking over his shoulder at us inside the castle and saying, "Come on, throw open the gates to the kingdom and bring the party outside here onto the streets." See, this isn't a parable about coming to the party. It's a parable about leading the party. We are called to be with Jesus in the streets, inviting and serving those who have been left out. Not inside the safety of our castle, not inside the safety of the church, and not inside the safety of our own little circles. You know, if we look around, there's a lot of people here today, and it's really, really good. And Jesus is here. But he's also out there in the streets. And so this isn't to say, don't come to church because the party's not here. But it is to say that when you leave here, take the party with you. To take Jesus with you. The attire required for Jesus' party is totally different. And you're going to have to leave your prim and proper notions at home and strip off your wedding robe and wash off your painted faces and put down your glass. And it's time to get that baptismal garment, dirty and stained with the grime of the world.